Hello dear friends, and welcome to The Sleepy Christian. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? World map. Drop it in the comments below. Whether you're tuning in from a quiet village, a bustling city, or somewhere in between, you are part of this beautiful, growing family. Now, let's talk about a man who fell asleep in the middle of a storm, not because he was at peace, but because he was running from his purpose. Jonah was a prophet, not just any man, but someone chosen by God to carry his message. He had heard the voice of the Lord. He had received a direct calling, a divine assignment: go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it. But instead of rising in obedience, Jonah ran. He fled in the opposite direction to a place called Tarshish. And in doing so, he wasn't just avoiding a city, he was avoiding a purpose, a calling, a responsibility that felt too heavy, too dangerous, or maybe too undeserved to be carried out. And as he boarded the ship, headed toward a place far from the voice of God, the storm began. The sky darkened, the wind howled, the sea roared. But where was Jonah? Was he on the deck, helping the sailors? Was he praying, asking for God's mercy? He had gone below. He had found a quiet corner in the lowest part of the ship. And there, while the storm threatened to tear everything apart, Jonah fell asleep. This moment, this strange, haunting moment, is rich with meaning. Jonah's sleep was not the rest of a peaceful man. It was the escape of a man at war with his own conscience. He was not resting in faith, like Jesus asleep in the boat during a storm. Jonah was hiding from truth, from purpose, from God himself. And isn't that something we all do, in our own ways? When we are overwhelmed, afraid, or unwilling to face what God is asking of us, we often go below deck. We hide in the distractions of life. We bury ourselves in work, in entertainment, in busyness, or even in silence. We close our eyes to the spiritual storms around us and within us. And we sleep, not because we're tired, but because we're avoiding something deeper. Jonah's story reminds us that it's entirely possible to be chosen by God and still choose to run. It's possible to be called and still be afraid. It's possible to have a destiny and still bury your head in a pillow, hoping it all just goes away. Jonah wasn't wicked in the way we often think. He didn't curse God. He didn't renounce his faith. But he didn't obey either. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a believer can do is nothing. To sleep when we're supposed to speak. To rest when we're supposed to rise. Jonah's sleep reveals the spiritual state of many of us, numbed, detached, lulled into a kind of apathy because purpose feels too hard, because the world we're called to confront feels too broken, too far gone. But here's the truth. God didn't ask Jonah if he felt like going. He didn't wait for Jonah to be ready. He simply called him. And that call, once spoken, doesn't disappear just because we're tired, scared, or uninterested. It follows us, it echoes in the wind, it rides the waves, it thunders through the storm. Jonah thought he could outrun his mission, but God is not bound by geography. The storm was proof of that. And even more, Jonah's sleep was not just a personal moment. It affected everyone on that boat. That's the hidden cost of spiritual sleep. When we avoid our calling, other people suffer. When we hide from our assignment, the ship rocks, the storm rages. Innocent lives are thrown into chaos, not because of their own actions, but because the one who was supposed to rise chose instead to sleep. This story is not just about a man and a fish. It's about what happens when someone called by God goes silent, when the voice that was meant to carry truth is muffled by fear. Jonah slept, not from peace, but from disobedience. And in that sleep, he almost lost everything. The storm was real. The danger was real. But so was God's mercy. And even as Jonah slept, grace was moving. God didn't destroy the ship. He stirred it. He shook it. He allowed the winds and the waves to do what the prophet's conscience could not. Awaken him to the reality that you can't run forever and you cannot sleep through your calling. So if you find yourself spiritually asleep today, not out of laziness, but out of fear, guilt, or shame, know this: the same God who called Jonah is calling you, not to punish you, but to awaken you, to bring you back, to give you a second chance. Even if you're in the belly of your own storm, He still knows your name. He still remembers the purpose He placed in your life. And He's still waiting, patiently, lovingly, for you to rise. Sleep is one of the most comforting images in Scripture. It symbolizes peace, trust, and divine rest. The Psalms tell us that God gives His beloved sleep. Jesus Himself slept in a boat during a storm, and His sleep was a picture of perfect trust in the Father. But not all sleep is peaceful. Not all sleep is holy. Some sleep is a form of escape, a numbing of the soul, a spiritual sedation that keeps us from facing what God has asked of us. That was Jonah's kind of sleep. When Jonah descended into the belly of the ship and lay down to sleep, it wasn't because he was at rest in God's will. It was because he wanted to forget it, to shut his eyes tightly enough to drown out the voice he had already heard too clearly. He wasn't sleeping from contentment. He was sleeping from conviction. And many of us, without realizing it, are doing the same. We think that because we aren't doing anything outwardly wrong, we're fine. We're not rebelling. We're not fighting. We're not cursing God. We're just tired. So we sleep. We pull away. We stop praying. We go through the motions of faith without engaging the heart of it. We drift. We numb. We spiritually hibernate. But this kind of sleep is dangerous because it feels peaceful, even when it's not. It feels restful, but underneath it, there's a storm, a calling that hasn't been answered, a purpose that's been postponed, a voice that's been muffled under layers of distraction, fatigue, and avoidance. Sleep isn't always a break. Sometimes it's a barrier, a place we hide in when we're afraid of what obedience might cost us. Think about Jonah. He wasn't new to hearing God's voice. He had likely been obedient before. But something about this specific mission to Nineveh broke him. Nineveh was brutal. It was a city known for cruelty and violence. The idea that God wanted to save them, to show mercy to them, that was too much for Jonah. So instead of wrestling with God, he pulled the covers over his head. He shut down. He closed off. What he didn't realize, and what we so often forget, is that disobedience doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just sleeps, and it's quieter, more comfortable, but it's still rebellion. It's still resistance. And it still leads us away from the heart of God. There is a kind of spiritual sleep that looks like calm on the outside, but inside is full of unrest. A storm is raging, a purpose is being delayed, a soul is running. This is not the rest Jesus promised. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." But that rest is on the other side of surrender. That peace is found in the will of God, not outside of it. The sleep Jonah found was not the rest of the obedient. It was the escape of the overwhelmed. The quiet corner he found in the ship was not holy ground. It was a hiding place. And yet, how often do we settle for the same thing? We choose quiet over confrontation, delay over decision, numbness over movement. We say we're waiting on God, but we're really avoiding Him. We say we need a break, but we're really breaking away. And all the while, our souls grow distant, our prayers grow cold, and our hearts lose the fire they once had. That's what spiritual sleep can do. It sneaks up on us. It tells us that it's okay to rest a little longer, that someone else will answer the call, that the storm will pass on its own, that it's not our responsibility, not our time, not our battle. But the longer we stay asleep, the more disconnected we become. The harder it is to hear, the easier it is to forget who we are and why we were called. The irony of Jonah's story is that while he was sleeping, others were praying. Pagan sailors were crying out to their gods, desperate for deliverance. And the one man who knew the true God, who had a direct line to heaven, was asleep below deck. That is perhaps the most painful part of spiritual sleep, that we can be surrounded by people in crisis, by a world crying out for help, and still be spiritually numb, still be too tired, too discouraged, too withdrawn to lift our voice. Jonah didn't just sleep through a storm. He slept through a moment where he was most needed, a moment designed to shake him awake, to bring him back to his calling, to remind him of who he was. And yet, in that moment, he chose silence. But God, in his mercy, didn't leave him there. He sent the storm not to punish, but to awaken. He allowed the winds and the waves not to destroy the ship, but to stir the heart of a prophet who had lost his fire. And that's good news for us too. If you feel like you've been asleep, not just physically but spiritually, it's not too late. If you've pulled away from your calling, if you've numbed yourself to avoid the weight of God's purpose in your life, you can still wake up. The storm isn't the end, it's an invitation. You may feel like Jonah. You may be at the bottom of the ship trying to forget, trying to rest, trying to escape. But even there, God is near. Even there, He knows how to find you, how to whisper or thunder until your heart stirs again. Because sleep isn't always peace, but God's voice, God's presence, God's mercy, that is where real peace is found. Not in avoidance, but in obedience. Not in escape, but in surrender. Not in sleep, but in rising. So rise. The storm is not your end. It may just be your awakening. We often think of storms as interruptions, as chaotic, unwanted events that crash into our lives, throwing everything out of order. But what if the storm wasn't an accident? What if it wasn't a punishment, but a divine intervention? What if the storm came because God was trying to reach us? That's exactly what happened to Jonah. He didn't just stumble into a natural disaster. The Bible tells us plainly, the Lord sent out a great wind on the sea. This wasn't random. This was orchestrated. God Himself stirred the sky, summoned the waves, and released the winds. The storm had a name on it. Jonah's name. This is a truth many of us struggle with. We like to believe that all storms are attacks, that all hardship comes from the enemy, that chaos is always bad. But the Bible shows us something deeper, that sometimes the storm is sent, not to harm us, but to awaken us, not to destroy us, but to turn us around. Jonah was running, not just from Nineveh, not just from the assignment, but from God. And God in His mercy said, I love you too much to let you go quietly. So He sent a storm. This kind of love is hard to understand. It's not soft. It's not gentle. It doesn't let us sleep in our disobedience or hide in our rebellion. It breaks in. It disrupts. It flips the ship. Because God knows what's at stake, and He knows who we're meant to be. The storm Jonah faced was custom designed. It didn't come to sink the ship. It came to wake up the prophet. The waves didn't roar to punish him. They roared to remind him, to shake his soul, to say, you can't run forever. You were made for more than this. And maybe that's where you are now. Maybe things in your life feel chaotic, uncertain, out of control. Maybe you've been wondering why everything seems to be falling apart. Relationships, plans, peace. Maybe, just maybe, the storm is not against you. Maybe it's for you. Sometimes, the fiercest storms in our lives are the result of our own spiritual drifting. We don't set out to rebel. We don't consciously defy God. We just take one small step away, then another, until we're far enough to feel numb and quiet enough to fall asleep. And then the storm comes, not to shame us, not to crush us, but to call us back. God could have abandoned Jonah. He could have picked someone else. He could have let him sail off into the sunset, lost in his own avoidance. But he didn't. He chased him with wind. He pursued him with waves. He surrounded him with thunder. Because when God has placed a purpose inside of you, He will not sit by and let it die quietly. This is the kind of Father He is. Not distant, but present. Not passive, but deeply involved. If you belong to Him, He will stir the sea to find you. The storm is not comfortable, of course. For Jonah, it was terrifying. The sailors panicked. The ship creaked and groaned. Everything that felt secure was suddenly shaken. But sometimes, security has to be shaken before we return to what really matters, before we remember who we are. In the middle of the storm, Jonah was confronted with a truth he could no longer escape. He had run from God. He had abandoned his mission, and no amount of sleep could silence that truth when the sky itself was screaming it. That's what storms do. They strip away the illusions. They wake us up to the reality we've been trying to avoid. They pull us out of our comfort zones and force us to ask the hard questions. Why am I here? What have I been ignoring? What is God trying to tell me? For Jonah, the storm became the turning point. It was the beginning of his return, the moment when running was no longer an option. He had to face the truth. He had to admit who he was and what he had done. And in that moment of surrender, not when the storm stopped, but when Jonah stopped running, the path back to purpose began. We don't like storms. They are loud. They are unsettling. They remind us that we're not in control. But sometimes, losing control is the very thing that brings us back to God. Because God isn't just in the stillness, He's in the storm. He speaks through the chaos. He reaches us in the shaking. And if the storm is what it takes to bring us back to Him, He will allow it. But even in the storm, there is mercy. The ship didn't sink. Jonah didn't drown. God's purpose was not cancelled. It was simply delayed, waiting for His surrender. You may feel like everything around you is falling apart. You may be wondering why the winds won't stop. But have you considered that the storm might be your rescue? That it might be God's hand, not His wrath? He hasn't forgotten you. He hasn't abandoned you. He knows exactly where you are. And if He's allowing the storm, it's because He still sees the purpose in you. He still remembers the calling. He still wants to use you. So don't just pray for the storm to end. Ask what the storm is trying to teach you. Ask what part of your life needs to wake up. Ask where you've been running and what it would take to return. Because sometimes the storm isn't meant to stop you. It's meant to find you. It's one of the most haunting moments in the story of Jonah. The storm is raging. The ship is creaking. The sailors are panicking. And Jonah is asleep. Not just resting, not just taking a nap between tasks, but deeply asleep in the lowest part of the ship, completely unaware, or perhaps intentionally ignoring the chaos above him. Meanwhile, the people who didn't even know Jonah's God were wide awake, desperately praying, calling out to their own gods, throwing cargo overboard in a frantic attempt to survive. This contrast is jarring. The ones who don't know the truth are crying out for answers. And the one who does know the truth, the one who walks with the true God, is silent. He's absent. He's unavailable. Jonah, the prophet, the believer, is asleep while the world is in crisis. And this isn't just Jonah's story. It's our story. It's the story of the church. It's the story of any believer who, for whatever reason, has grown numb to the world's cries. who has gone quiet when they were meant to speak, who has found comfort below deck while the storm rages above. There are moments in history and in our personal lives when this becomes painfully real, when the people around us, friends, co-workers, neighbors, even strangers, are searching for hope, when their lives are unraveling, when fear is gripping them, when sin is destroying them, and they are reaching, crying, pleading for something, anything to hold on to, something that is real, something that saves. And yet, so often, the ones who know the truth are the ones who are most silent, most hidden, most asleep. Why? Because being awake is uncomfortable. Being awake means you have to care. Being awake means you have to do something, speak, move, obey, risk. Being awake means facing the hard truth that you were called not just to believe in God, but to represent Him, to carry His love into places that are hurting, to shine light where it's dark, to say the hard things when silence would be easier. It's easier to sleep, easier to stay in the shadows of spiritual avoidance, easier to believe privately and act like nothing is wrong publicly, easier to say, "It's not my storm," or "They brought it on themselves," or "Someone else will help them." It's easier to stay quiet, but that quiet is costly, because while Jonah slept, others suffered. While Jonah hid, people feared for their lives. And what's heartbreaking is that those sailors were not evil men. They were simply desperate. They were doing what they knew how to do, calling out to their gods, begging for mercy, seeking light in the darkness. And the one man who had the light was asleep. Imagine their confusion. They're frantically praying while Jonah snores in the dark. They're doing everything they can to survive, and he's just lying there, numb, disconnected, detached. The storm is threatening all of them, and the only one who knows why it's happening is unreachable. Eventually, the captain goes down and finds him, and what he says cuts deep. "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe He will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Did you catch that? A non-believer rebukes the prophet. The unbeliever tells the believer to pray. The one who doesn't know God has to remind the one who does to wake up. That's where we are now, in many ways. The world is crying out for hope, for healing, for truth, and so often, it is the church that is silent. The ones who know the name of Jesus are sometimes the last to speak it. The ones who have access to divine peace are sometimes the most anxious. The ones who carry the answer are sometimes the most unavailable. And here's the terrifying reality. It is entirely possible to know God, to have history with Him, to have experienced His voice and still fall asleep at the exact moment He needs you awake. Jonah wasn't a pagan, he wasn't a novice, he was a prophet. And yet, when the world needed a prophet to speak, to stand, to pray, he had disappeared into sleep. This should not just convict us, it should stir us. Because if we are not careful, we too will become sleepy Christians, numb Christians, apathetic Christians. We'll attend church, say the right words, nod at the right moments, but our hearts will be disengaged. Our spirits asleep. Our calling buried under fear or pride or comfort or distraction. And the world will keep crying out. The sailors of our time may not be on ships, but they are all around us. In hospitals, on street corners, in homes, in classrooms, online, behind closed doors. People desperate for peace. People exhausted by storms. People trying everything they know to survive. And if we, the ones who carry hope, are asleep, then who will speak? It is not enough to believe in God. Jonah believed in God. That's not what saved the sailors. What saved them was when Jonah finally woke up, when he admitted the truth, when he faced his calling, when he stopped hiding and surrendered to what God had asked of him. That's what changes lives. not passive belief, but active obedience. Awake, alert, humble obedience. So today, if you feel asleep, spiritually numb, distant, quiet, know this: you are not alone. Jonah was there. Many of us have been there, but also know that God is not done with you. The storm is not a punishment. It's a wake-up call, not just for you, but for those around you. You matter. Your voice matters. Your obedience matters. Because someone's storm may not calm until you wake up and step into who you were created to be. Jonah thought he could escape. He truly believed that by getting on a ship headed in the opposite direction, he could outrun God's voice, that he could outmaneuver the divine assignment placed on his life, that he could leave behind the pressure, the responsibility, the discomfort of being chosen. He bought a ticket. He boarded a ship. He went below deck. And for a while, it may have felt like it was working. The sea was calm. The world was quiet. His heart, though unsettled, was perhaps relieved until the storm came. The truth is, you can run from many things in life. You can run from people, from cities, from jobs, from relationships. You can even run from your past, but you cannot outrun the call of God. You cannot escape the voice that spoke your name before you were born. You cannot permanently silence the purpose that was stitched into your soul before the foundations of the world were laid. Jonah tried, and for a moment, it seemed like he had gotten away with it. But God was not finished. Because when God places a call on your life, He doesn't revoke it simply because you feel afraid. He doesn't cancel your purpose because you've made a wrong turn. He doesn't choose someone else just because you're hesitating. God pursues. He chases. He interrupts. Not to punish, but to redeem. Not to destroy, but to restore. Jonah had a job to do, and not just any job. He was sent to Nineveh, a city known for its cruelty and darkness, a place filled with people who had no knowledge of the living God. God's plan was not just about Jonah's obedience, it was about Nineveh's salvation. Jonah's yes wasn't just about him, it was about the thousands who needed a chance to repent, to turn, to live. That's the thing about your calling. It's never just about you. It's about the people on the other side of your obedience, the ones who will never know freedom unless you speak, the ones who will never find light unless you shine, the ones who will never turn toward God unless you go where you're sent. When Jonah said no to God, he wasn't just rejecting a task. He was putting an entire city's redemption at risk. He was turning his back on a divine chain reaction meant to transform lives. But God loved Nineveh too much to let Jonah say no, and God loved Jonah too much to let him run forever. So he sent the storm. He stirred the sea. He moved the hearts of the sailors to cast lots. And even after Jonah admitted his guilt and was thrown into the waves, God had not abandoned him. He prepared a fish, a vessel of mercy in the middle of judgment, a second chance in the form of confinement. Because here's the great paradox of calling. You can resist it, but you can't erase it. You can delay it, but you can't destroy it. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, and God is more committed to your purpose than you are afraid of it. Inside the belly of the fish, Jonah was stripped of every illusion of control. He had no more escape plans, no more distractions, no more ships to run to. All he had was darkness, silence, and the echo of God's voice. It was there, in that most uncomfortable, terrifying place, that Jonah finally surrendered. It took a storm, a ship, and a sea creature to bring him to that point, but he got there, and God was waiting. Your calling won't let you hide forever. You can pretend it doesn't exist. You can bury yourself in routine. You can convince yourself that you're not worthy, not ready, not qualified. But the call of God is patient. It will wait. And when the time comes, it will rise again. Sometimes gently, sometimes like a tidal wave, but it will come. Because God doesn't forget what He placed inside you. Maybe you've been running, like Jonah. Maybe you've spent years trying to go the opposite direction. Maybe fear, shame, or disappointment has convinced you that it's too late, that you missed your chance, that someone else has taken your place. But hear this. If Jonah's story tells us anything, it's that God does not give up on His vessels. He doesn't throw people away. He doesn't withdraw His assignment because you made a mistake. He will go to great lengths to bring you back. Not because He needs you, but because He wants you, because He loves you, and because He still intends to use you. Even in Jonah's disobedience, God's hand never left him. The storm wasn't wrath, it was grace disguised as thunder. The fish wasn't punishment, it was protection, wrapped in darkness. And the silence wasn't abandonment, it was the sacred space where Jonah could finally listen. You may feel like you've gone too far, sunk too deep, drifted too long. But your calling is not cancelled. Your purpose is not gone. God is still calling, still reaching, still believing in the person He created you to be. You can't hide forever, because what God placed in you was never meant to stay hidden. It was meant to shine, to speak, to heal, to transform. And even now, through every detour and delay, God is weaving your return, creating moments that will bring you to your knees, not to condemn you, but to remind you of who you really are. So don't be afraid when the storm comes. Don't panic when the ship rocks or when the sea swallows you up. These may be the very signs that your calling is still alive, that God is still reaching for you, that He's not done. You were made for more than hiding. You were made for obedience, for purpose, for impact. And even if it takes a storm and a sea and the belly of a great fish, God will find a way to bring you back. Because your calling, like His love, is relentless. The belly of the fish, cold, dark, silent, a place of total confinement, no light, no exit, no sound but the slow, gurgling groan of the sea creature that had swallowed him whole. Jonah had never felt so alone, so powerless, so finished. And yet, this was the place, of all places, where everything would begin again. This part of Jonah's story is often overlooked. The great fish is sometimes reduced to a strange plot twist or a moment of divine punishment. But in truth, it was neither random nor cruel. The fish was mercy. It was God's hand disguised as something terrifying, a shelter disguised as a prison, a timeout designed for transformation. When Jonah hit the water, he probably expected death. He had told the sailors to throw him overboard. He believed that by giving himself up, the storm would calm and their lives would be spared. Maybe in his mind it was the only way out. He had run too far, disobeyed too deeply. He didn't imagine another chance was waiting for him. But God did. Jonah didn't see the fish coming. He couldn't have. But God had prepared it. The Bible says, the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah. Not by accident, not by chance. The fish was already in place before Jonah ever hit the water. That means God had planned a place for him to survive even in his moment of rebellion. A place to hold him, not to destroy him, but to give him the space to remember who he was. The belly of the fish is where Jonah finally stopped running, not because he no longer wanted to, but because he physically couldn't. There were no ships left, no escape routes, no noise to drown out the voice of God, just him, his thoughts, his regrets, and his prayers. It's often the same with us. When life is going well, when we're distracted, busy, surrounded by noise, we can tune out conviction. We can ignore the quiet voice of God calling us back. But when everything is stripped away, when we lose control, when we feel confined, when the light goes out, that's when we start to hear again. God often uses isolation to speak to us. Not because he wants us to suffer, but because it's in that space that all the false identities begin to fall away. It's where we stop pretending, stop performing, stop resisting, and finally become still enough to listen. For Jonah, the belly of the fish became the place of reflection. He began to remember the Lord. He began to cry out, not in polished religious language, but in raw, honest desperation. The second chapter of the book of Jonah records his prayer from inside that strange and sacred prison. And it's beautiful, not because it's poetic, but because it's real. It's the prayer of a man who is finally face to face with the consequences of his choices. A man who knows he's broken, who knows he ran, who knows he disobeyed, and yet who still dares to lift his eyes upward and say, God, hear me. Jonah prayed, "From the depths of the grave I called for help, and you listened to my cry." Imagine the humility in that. The realization that even after everything, even from the lowest place imaginable, God still listens. That is the miracle. Not just that Jonah was kept alive in the belly of a fish, but that God was still near, that he didn't block Jonah out, that he didn't say, "You had your chance." Instead, he heard. He leaned in. He received the prayer of a man who had run the other way. And if God did that for Jonah, he will do it for you. Maybe you are in a belly of the fish moment, a place that feels like confinement, a season that feels dark and isolating, a chapter of your life where everything seems to have stopped, where the silence is deafening, and you wonder if God is still listening. He is. The belly of the fish is not your grave. It's your grace. It's not your end. It's your in-between. A holy pause, a divine detour, a moment set apart not to punish you, but to bring you back to yourself, to your calling, to your God. Jonah learned more in those 3 days of darkness than he ever did on land. Because sometimes it's not until you have nothing left, no control, no voice, no plan, that you realize the one thing you still have is God. And when everything else is stripped away, what remains is what matters most. The belly of the fish becomes the classroom of the soul. It teaches us humility. It teaches us surrender. It teaches us that we were never in control to begin with, and that the only way forward is not to swim harder or fight more, but to let go. To lift your voice, even if it trembles. To pray, even if you don't know how. To say, "Lord, I've run, but I'm here now." Jonah came out of the fish changed. Not perfect, but surrendered. He had been broken open, humbled, hallowed. And when the fish finally released him onto dry land, he was ready to say yes. That's the power of the belly of the fish. It looks like failure, but it becomes the place of formation. It feels like death, but it becomes the birthplace of new life. It feels like God has left you, but it is, in truth, the clearest sign that He is still writing your story. So don't despise the season of darkness. Don't curse the silence. Don't assume that confinement means abandonment. Sometimes, the most sacred work God does in us happens when no one else can see. When it's just us and Him in the dark. When we're held, not because we're strong, but because we've stopped running. You may feel lost, but God knows exactly where you are. You may feel swallowed, but He's holding you. You may feel like your story is over, but maybe, just maybe, it's only just beginning. Obedience is not always comfortable. In fact, it rarely is. It doesn't come wrapped in convenience or ease. It often comes at a cost. For Jonah, obedience meant going to a place he feared, to speak to people he didn't like, and deliver a message they didn't want to hear. It meant facing the very thing he had run away from. And yet, after the storm, after the sea, after 3 long days in the belly of the fish, Jonah obeyed. But it's important to understand, his obedience didn't immediately lead to comfort. It didn't lead to applause or joy or gratitude. What it led to was Nineveh, a place so wicked that even God had said their evil had come up before him. It led to walking through a city that symbolized everything Jonah found repulsive. It meant standing in enemy territory with nothing but a message of warning and a heart that had only just begun to soften. That's the part of obedience we don't often talk about. We like to imagine that when we finally say yes to God, everything will fall into place. That the road will become smooth, the doors will open, and the blessings will pour down. And yes, obedience does bring blessing, but often not in the way we expect. Not in the form of instant ease, not in the form of external reward. Sometimes obedience leads us straight into discomfort, straight into unfamiliar territory, straight into the heart of the mission God always had in mind. Jonah's mission was to deliver a simple, chilling message. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. That's it. No lengthy speech, no bargaining, no fluff, just judgment. Jonah didn't offer hope. He didn't offer steps to redemption. He simply spoke what God told him to speak. And yet, something extraordinary happened. The people of Nineveh believed him. These people, known for their violence and arrogance, heard the message and took it seriously. They fasted. They mourned. Even the king took off his royal robes, put on sackcloth, and sat in ashes. He issued a decree that everyone, man and beast, should fast and cry out to God and turn from their evil ways. They didn't wait for proof. They didn't ask for signs. They simply responded. This moment reveals something incredibly powerful about obedience. When we do what God asks, even if it's uncomfortable, even if we don't fully understand the why, God moves. He works through our weakness. He honors our willingness, and he does more with our obedience than we could ever do with our strategies or strength. Jonah's reluctant yes became the spark for one of the greatest revivals in Scripture. An entire city repented. An entire culture paused. And God, in his compassion, relented from destroying them. But notice what didn't happen. Jonah didn't get a hero's welcome. He didn't feel overjoyed. In fact, he was upset, angry even, because deep down, part of Jonah had obeyed with the secret hope that God wouldn't forgive them, that Nineveh would get what they deserved. And when they didn't, when mercy triumphed over judgment, Jonah was left to wrestle with his own heart. This is another layer of obedience we often overlook. It will not always make us feel good. Sometimes it will expose things inside of us that we didn't know were still broken. It will reveal hidden bitterness, pride, or resentment. Jonah's obedience did what it was supposed to do externally, but internally, he was still struggling. And yet, God didn't reject him. Instead, he patiently engaged him. He asked questions. He challenged Jonah's view of justice. He invited him deeper, not just into mission, but into relationship. Because to God, obedience is not just about tasks, it's about transformation. He's not just after your yes, he's after your heart. Obedience is rarely glamorous. It often means stepping into places where you are misunderstood, unappreciated, even resented. It means carrying a message that may not be welcomed. It means letting go of the outcome and trusting that God is using your faithfulness, even when you can't see the results. But obedience is always worth it, not because it guarantees earthly comfort, but because it aligns you with the heart of heaven, because it opens the door for God to move through you in ways you never imagined. because it brings you face to face with the purpose you were created for. Jonah's obedience didn't fix everything in his heart overnight, but it did place him exactly where God needed him to be. It did allow a wicked city to encounter grace. It did prove that God can use even the most reluctant servant to fulfill his divine will. And here's the grace in that truth. God is not looking for perfection. He's looking for participation. He's looking for those who, even after running, are willing to rise. Those who, even with doubts, will still step forward. Those who, even afraid, will still say yes. Because your obedience may not feel good at first, but it can change lives. It can shift atmospheres. It can unleash mercy where there was once only judgment. And over time, it can reshape you too. You may be called to walk into your own Nineveh, a place that feels difficult, a task that feels bigger than your capacity, a people you may not even want to love. But when you go, when you obey, you don't go alone. God goes with you. God speaks through you. And God works in ways you cannot predict. Don't measure the worth of your obedience by how easy it feels. Measure it by who called you, and trust that his purposes are always bigger and always better than your comfort zone. You obey not because it's easy. You obey because it's eternal. There's a moment in every believer's life when the storm has not yet come, but the whispers of conviction are already stirring. A moment when you sense something is not right, when God is calling, when purpose is knocking, but you stay where you are. You stay asleep, spiritually numb, spiritually tired, choosing delay over decision. That's the moment Jonah had before the storm broke. And that's the moment many of us live in for far too long. We tell ourselves it's just a season, that we need rest, that we're still figuring things out. We think we're being wise by waiting, by not rushing into anything. But deep down, if we're honest, we know the truth. We're sleeping, not physically, but spiritually. Not because we're peaceful, but because we're afraid. Because we don't want to deal with what God is asking of us. Because facing his voice might mean facing our own resistance, our own wounds, our own fears. Spiritual sleep is quiet, subtle, deceptive. It's not dramatic like rebellion. It doesn't shout. It doesn't shake its fist at the heavens. It simply turns down the volume, slows things down. It keeps you just busy enough to avoid stillness, just distracted enough to miss God's whisper, just safe enough to avoid the risk of obedience. But the danger is real, because spiritual sleep leads to spiritual death, not instantly, but gradually. Your fire fades, your passion dulls, your prayers become routines. The hunger you once had for God becomes replaced by apathy. And all the while, the purpose that was placed in your life from the beginning waits in silence, waiting for you to wake up. You don't need a storm to wake you, but if you stay asleep long enough, the storm will come, not out of punishment, but out of love. God will shake what needs to be shaken to bring you back to life. He'll rock the boat, stir the waters, disrupt the false peace, not to harm you, but to remind you of who you are and what you were called to do. You don't have to wait for everything to fall apart. You don't have to wait until you hit rock bottom. You don't have to wait for the belly of the fish. You can choose to wake up now. God is always speaking. The question is never whether he's calling. It's whether we're listening, whether we've positioned our hearts to hear him, whether we've silenced the noise long enough to recognize his voice, whether we're willing to get up before the waves start to crash. The sad irony is that Jonah, a prophet of God, was the one asleep while the pagans were praying. The people who didn't know the truth were wide awake, crying out, seeking help. And the one man who actually knew the truth, who had the power to intercede, was below deck in a deep sleep. How many of us, as believers, are living in that same irony? The world is crying out. The broken are groaning. The lost are seeking. And we, the ones who know Jesus, the ones who carry the light, are numb, busy, distracted, asleep. Not because we don't care, but because we've forgotten how much we matter. Because we've grown comfortable in our survival instead of stepping into our calling. It's easier to sleep when the task ahead looks too big. When the people God calls us to love don't seem to deserve it. When the places He calls us to go feel dangerous or uncomfortable. When the message He asks us to speak feels unpopular. It's easier to pretend we didn't hear Him, to go through the motions of faith without the movement of faith. But spiritual sleep costs us something. It costs others something too. When Jonah slept, the sailors suffered. The storm wasn't just his problem. It became everyone's problem. His silence endangered lives, and so does ours. You may think your disobedience only affects you, that your lack of movement, your delay, your avoidance is personal. But there are people who are waiting on your yes. There are lives on the other side of your obedience. There are destinies connected to your willingness. Your story is not just yours. It's a bridge for someone else's salvation, a lifeline for someone else's breakthrough. So don't wait for the storm to wake you. Wake up now. Wake up to the truth that you are called, that you are chosen, that you are anointed, even if you don't feel like it, that your past doesn't disqualify you, that your fears don't define you, that the voice of God is still speaking, still calling, still loving you back to life. The storm is not the enemy, it's a teacher. But how much better would it be if you could hear the lesson without the chaos? How much sweeter would it be to obey before the winds howl, before the waves crash, before the ship starts sinking? That's the mercy of God. He warns before He shakes. He whispers before He thunders. He invites before He intervenes. And even when we ignore Him, He still pursues us. But imagine what could happen if we responded now. If we said yes before the storm. If we allowed the stillness of conviction to stir us instead of waiting for the violence of disruption. Imagine what could happen in your family, in your community, in your own soul if you simply chose to wake up now. You don't need another sign. You don't need another miracle. You don't need more confirmation. You already know. The voice of God has already stirred your heart. The assignment is already planted within you. The world is already groaning, and heaven is already watching, waiting for you to rise. So rise, not because it's easy, but because it's time. Because the God who called you is still waiting, still reaching, still believing in you, even when you've stopped believing in yourself. Wake up, child of God. The storm hasn't come yet, but the call has. And you were made to answer. Jonah's story is often told as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when we run from God. But when you look closer, it's actually a story of incredible hope. Because it proves something we often forget, that even after the storm, even after the rebellion, even after the darkest and most shameful chapters of our lives, purpose is still waiting. God doesn't throw away His plans just because we took a detour. He doesn't discard us just because we failed. In fact, He redeems the very things we thought had ruined us. Jonah's return to purpose didn't begin with celebration. It began with surrender. It began in the belly of the fish, where he admitted he had been wrong, where he cried out from the depths and remembered the God he had once tried to escape. And the moment he turned his heart back, everything shifted. The fish, the confinement, the darkness, it all had a divine expiration date. Jonah was not destined to stay in that place of isolation. God commanded the fish and it released him. But notice what happens next. The very next verse says, "Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time." That one sentence holds the weight of the entire gospel. A second time. After the failure, after the running, after the silence. God didn't say, "You blew it." He didn't say, "I'll find someone else." He said, let's try again. That's what grace looks like. That's what redemption sounds like. Not just forgiveness, but reinstatement. God didn't just forgive Jonah, he recommissioned him. He gave him another chance to step into his original purpose. Because in God's kingdom, calling isn't cancelled by failure, it's clarified by it. When you come out of your storm, you don't come out with less. You come out with more humility, more dependence, more clarity, more power. Jonah rose from that beach not as the same man who ran away, but as someone who had been broken and rebuilt. Someone who knew firsthand the mercy of God. Someone who could speak not just with authority, but with experience. And this time, when God said, "Go to Nineveh," Jonah didn't hesitate. He went. The journey wasn't glamorous. Nineveh was still Nineveh, violent, arrogant, and lost. But Jonah's heart was different. His fear had been replaced by obedience. His running had been replaced by walking, step after step, toward a city that represented everything he once avoided. Because now, Jonah understood that the storm wasn't just a detour, it was the very path that led him back to his purpose. And when he arrived, he didn't deliver a long, eloquent sermon. He simply spoke the word God had given him. 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. A sentence of judgment, a countdown of doom. But even that, spoken in obedience, carried divine power. Because it wasn't about the eloquence of Jonah's words, it was about the weight of God's presence behind them. To Jonah's surprise, and maybe even to his disappointment, the people of Nineveh listened. They repented. They tore their clothes, fasted, cried out for mercy. Even the king humbled himself, stepped off his throne, and bowed low in dust and ashes. And God, rich in compassion, responded. He did not bring destruction, he brought mercy. Jonah's obedience unlocked Nineveh's revival. Let that sink in. A city on the brink of judgment was saved because one man finally stopped running. One man said yes. One man stepped into a purpose that had nearly been lost to fear and pride and shame. And that one act of obedience unleashed a chain reaction of repentance and grace. You don't know what's on the other side of your yes. You don't know what family, what community, what city might be transformed when you finally step into what God created you to do. Your story, even the broken parts, especially the broken parts, is the vessel God wants to use. The storm you survived wasn't for nothing. The tears you cried, the nights you wrestled, the mistakes you made, none of it disqualifies you. In fact, it prepares you. It equips you to speak with empathy, to lead with humility, to serve with understanding. Because now, you're not just obeying a command, you're embodying a testimony. From the storm to your purpose is not a straight line. It's a journey marked by struggle and surrender, by correction and compassion. But it's a journey that reveals the heart of God, a God who doesn't abandon us in our rebellion, who doesn't shame us in our failure, but who walks with us through the chaos and calls us back when we're ready to listen. Even when you're surrounded by consequences, you're still surrounded by grace. Even when you've lost your way, you haven't lost your worth. The storm may have shaken you, but it didn't erase the calling on your life. God still has work for you to do. And if you let Him, He will use every piece of your story, not just the victories, but the valleys, not just the moments of obedience, but the moments when you broke down and turned back. That's the power of divine purpose. It isn't fragile. It doesn't depend on your perfection. It depends on your willingness to return, to rise, to say yes, again. Jonah came full circle. From the moment he ran to the moment he obeyed, God was writing a redemption story, and He's doing the same for you. Don't assume that the storm disqualifies you. It might be the very thing that equips you. Don't believe the lie that it's too late. In God's timing, Nothing is wasted. From the storm to your purpose is a journey of grace. And even now, God is still calling you forward. There comes a moment in every believer's life when the stillness is louder than the storm, when the chaos has passed, but the questions remain, when the waves have settled, but the soul still trembles. That moment is not always dramatic. Sometimes it's just quiet, a quiet ache, a quiet whisper, a quiet nudge from God that says, "Wake up, child. I'm not done with you." For Jonah, this moment came after everything. After the call, the rebellion, the storm, the fish, the second chance, the obedience, and even the revival of Nineveh. He had done what God asked. The mission was complete. The city was spared. Lives were changed. But inside Jonah, there was still unrest, a lingering frustration, a stubborn anger that the people he disliked had received mercy, that God had, once again, been slow to anger and abounding in love. And so Jonah sat outside the city, sulking, waiting to see what would happen next. He was obedient, but not fully surrendered. He had delivered the message, but his heart was still resistant, still wrestling. And in that place of tension, God once again came to speak, not through fire or flood, but through a plant, a small leafy vine that gave Jonah shade in the scorching heat. For a moment, Jonah was happy, grateful, comfortable. But then, the next morning, God appointed a worm. The plant withered, the sun rose, the wind howled, and Jonah once again was miserable, angry enough to die. It seemed like such a small thing, losing a bit of shade, but to Jonah, it was everything. And that's when God asked the question that echoes through time. Is it right for you to be angry? God wasn't just speaking to Jonah's discomfort. He was speaking to his heart, to his priorities, to his misunderstanding of divine mercy. Jonah cared more about the plant than the people, more about his comfort than their salvation. And yet, even in that immaturity, even in that selfishness, God was still patient, still teaching, still fathering the prophet who was so prone to sleep and sulking. This final scene is so human, so raw, and so important, because it reminds us that waking up isn't a one-time event. It's not just about saying yes once. It's about continuing to rise, day after day, moment after moment, into the fullness of who God is calling you to be. You can be obedient and still be asleep in some parts of your heart. You can do the right thing externally and still be wrestling internally. But God, in His mercy, continues to work with us, to shape us, to invite us deeper. When God says, "Wake up, child," it's not always because we're rebelling. Sometimes it's because we've settled, because we've stopped growing, because we've allowed our pain or disappointment to lull us back into spiritual drowsiness. We've forgotten the joy of walking closely with Him. We've lost the wonder of His mercy, not just toward us, but toward others. And He calls us back, not with shame, not with condemnation, but with the same gentle voice that spoke over Jonah's life from the beginning. Wake up, I still want to use you. Wake up, there's more I want to show you. Wake up. Your heart still matters to me. This final call is one of relationship, not just responsibility. Jonah had fulfilled the assignment, but God still wanted his heart, still wanted his attention, still wanted Jonah to understand what he was really about. Not just judgment, but mercy. Not just truth, but love. Not just mission, but transformation. And that's the invitation for you too. You may have gone through your storm. You may have obeyed the call. You may have stepped back into purpose. But if your heart is still weary, still angry, still cold, God is not finished. He is calling you to wake up again, to feel again, to trust again, to believe Not just that he has a purpose for you, but that he is good, that his mercy is wide, that his grace is scandalous, that his love stretches far beyond what you can understand or control. Jonah couldn't control Nineveh's response. He couldn't control God's compassion, and neither can we. But we can choose to rise, to allow God to keep shaping us, even when it's uncomfortable, even when we don't understand. Because to be fully awake as a Christian is to live with a heart aligned to the heart of God, a heart that rejoices in mercy, that weeps for the broken, that obeys, not just with action, but with affection. That sees people the way God sees them, even when it's hard. You were never meant to live your life half asleep, numb to the suffering around you, indifferent to your own spiritual hunger. You were created to live fully alive in Christ, awake to his voice, alive to his presence, anchored in his purpose. The world doesn't just need people who believe. It needs people who are awake, people who move when God speaks, who love when it's difficult, who obey even when it costs, who surrender not just once, but again and again. The story of Jonah ends with a question, not with a resolution. We don't know how he responded to God's final words. We don't know if he softened, if he wept, if he returned home changed. And maybe that's the point, because the question isn't just for Jonah, it's for you, it's for me, it's for every believer who's ever drifted, who's ever run, who's ever wrestled with God's mercy and wondered what comes next. The question is, will you wake up? Not just once, but every time God calls, every time his mercy stretches wider than your comfort, every time his love challenges your assumptions, every time he asks you to look deeper, to live fuller, to love harder. Wake up, child of God. There's more grace, more purpose, more healing, more love, more of him, and he's still calling your name.